Yeah, so I've changed the title of my talk. I want to talk in more general about the problem of civilian distinction in cyber warfare, which I think is a useful term to distinguish from proportionality, where you just worry about the concern of whether you're attacking civilians. And I see a lot of problems, basically, with cyber warfare and the civilian distinction. There are colleagues of mine like Dorothy Denning who disagree with that, and I totally disagree with her opinion that this distinction is easy to do in cyber warfare. In fact, I think it's quite a difficult challenge, and I'll talk about some of the problems with it. First of all, my disclaimer, I do not represent the US government. The US government probably doesn't agree with most of the things I'm going to say here, but I think they are things we have to start thinking about. One of the things that motivated me was Stuxnet, because I thought this was a pretty sloppy operation. I really did not think, like some people in the US government thought this was a great success of the US government, or if it indeed was due to the US government. There were about 10,000 machines that were infected. So this is my analysis of the collateral cost of Stuxnet that I published in one of the books on one of the papers on my website. One of the problems was that the damage was initially unclear. It used propagation mechanisms to get on lots of computer systems. So there are a lot of infected computer systems. Now, it doesn't matter whether they were damaged or not in the traditional sense and they were sabotaged, because anytime you got something unknown on a computer system, it's important to figure out what it is. And so there was a cost of finding it out and removing it, because it wasn't clear initially what on earth this software was. It was obviously not part of the operating system, and so it would certainly seem to be malicious. And so there's a certain cost associated with finding that stuff, figuring out what it is, and then removing it from computer systems. So I estimate that about 10 million machines were infected worldwide for this. And so that's collateral damage. You know, even though it was minor collateral damage on each machine, it still totals up over a lot of machines. And that's what I mean by the multiplier effect I was talking about yesterday. Even if you get minor damage from cyber warfare, if you multiply it over lots and lots of machines, you get to more significant damage. Of course, one of the problems with Stuxnet was figuring out what it was. So there was quite a lot of effort put into finding out how it was operating and trying to do stuff. And so I'm estimating maybe $1 million for the cost of doing all that stuff. There were also some attempts at attribution. Attribution might be more important with certain other types of cyber attacks. So there would be collateral costs associated with just trying to do the attribution. And then one of the things I'm most concerned is reuse of the attack. Since Stuxnet used apparently five different methods of exploiting systems, all those are perfectly useful for criminal activities, and in fact were used by criminals in subsequent attacks. How did the criminals find out about these methods? Well, there was a lot published on Stuxnet, and they just looked at what had been published and developed their own methods. Even when the details that were published were not completely full, usually just the idea that there was a vulnerability, just the reporting that there was a vulnerability in particular software was enough to build an exploit that criminals could use. So I'm estimating maybe $1 million as the collateral cost for that. So I'm estimating the total collateral cost of Stuxnet was $2.4 million. So it's not true that Stuxnet was a clean operation. I think we can do a lot better in cyber operations in the future. You can clearly see that if things were done indifferently, it could have been much higher cost, right? I mean, there were some mistakes that were made in the implementation of Stuxnet that led to some damage, and there could be clearly mistakes in the future. Just for comparison, the international standard for insurance is $50,000 per human life, so we're saying that Stuxnet was equivalent to killing one person in cost. Iran at one point claimed that somebody had been killed by one of the centrifuges, so that would be another person to count. So what we need to do is to have a little broader view of the collateral cost of cyber operations. Here's the additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, and it seems pretty clear here. The attack shall be limited strictly to military objectives. So when objects are concerned military objectives, those objects by their nature, location, or purpose or use make an effective contribution to military action. So a lot of these things involved in Stuxnet were not military objects. I mean, clearly they were operating systems, lots and lots of computer systems, and they were not confined to Iran by any means. One of the main problems that we have here is now we're getting propagation to all sorts of civilians in countries totally different. When you attack a country and have civilian damage, for instance, from a bomb, that's still confined to the country. And so, in a certain sense, the citizens of a country that are doing something would cause an action to be done against them are partly guilty through supporting their government of something. But here with cyber warfare, you can attack countries that are totally neutral all over the world because of the propagation of the methods and things like that. So the problem is civilian objects are all over cyberspace, and we've got lots and lots of civilian objects like operating systems, network protocols, web browsers, document handling, security management, all these critical things you need to run your computer systems. They're civilian objects and run by civilians, updated by civilians, and sold by civilian companies. And however, there are some military cyberspace objects. There are weapon systems, which are special software. There's platform and site defense systems, like defending your ship, for instance. Command and control systems, of course, important thing, that depend on networks. Military vehicles and weapons production systems, too. So those are all clearly military targets. But the problem with those is, those are really hard to attack, right? They're really well defended. And so there's just so much temptation to attack civilian targets because they're so much easier to do. And if you want to have an effect, and particularly if you're a country that's not too powerful, you know, like North Korea, you'd like to prefer to attack those things. So that's the main problem, that civilians are easy targets. And so even though we would like to say we're going to only attack military targets, there are going to be so many pressures not to do that, to actually attack some civilian targets. One of the problems also that makes this worse is that there are overly complex pieces of software out there. So Microsoft Windows is getting very complicated. I'll show you on the next slide. And you know, lots of these other things like Adobe Reader are getting harder and harder. It's just supposed to read a document, but it's gotten very, very complex in the software. And web browsers too. Military systems, on the other hand, are better protected. They're also better tested. One of the problems with civilian software is it doesn't get tested very much, so there are all sorts of flaws and bugs that somebody hasn't found yet. They're hoping that civilians will find for them. And when you have that approach, there's just going to be lots and lots of flaws in something. Unfortunately, in the United States, we don't have product liability for software, and so there's endless problems due to that. So we're going to check in cyber warfare, attackers are going to prefer civilian targets if they can, like banking, power plants, and transportation systems. And also, of course, there may be a symbolic effect of attacking those things. If you think that American banking is really evil, you know, a good thing to do is to attack Wall Street. So there's lots of reasons to attack civilian targets for many cyber attackers. Here's just the statistics on the size of the Windows operating system, starting with Windows 3.1. You see how much bigger it's gotten? This is, you know, a lot of this is unnecessary. Actually, Windows 3.1 ran perfectly fine. There was nothing wrong with it. It did pretty much everything an operating system needed to do. But vendors now are trying to lock you into their particular software, so they're adding all kinds of unnecessary features. And the number of flaws in software is at least proportional to the size of the software, like that right column there. In many cases, though, it's proportional to the square of the size of the software, because you have connections. The number of connections in something is proportional to its size. So you know, we're multiplying the opportunities. Even though Microsoft is getting better and better at finding flaws, the mere fact that they're expanding their software so much is the problem. Now, second reason why you can hit civilians in cyber warfare is you've got dual-use targets, which was talked about yesterday. So, of course, there are a lot of things that militaries share with civilians, and so you know, you have the networks and networking. In the United States, we use a lot of civilian stuff. As I'll talk about later, there is some segmentation, though. So, for instance, you can, if you use software attacks, you can focus on just attacking the military part of something, but it's hard to do. But if you just do some simple-minded network attack, often it's going to take down lots of civilians as well as the military. So can it be justified dual use? So the laws of war do allow dual use targets. One of the problems, though, is that you know, when we look at the spectrum of all digital activity, Civilian use is very predominant now. So I'm estimating, I was trying to get some statistics on how much of the networks are being used by the military, and nobody had a very good estimate, but we can look at the gross domestic product of the United States, and it's about 4% for military, 4% of the US resources used for the military, which is pretty typical for a lot of countries. And so I'm probably estimating that 4% of all the network use is going to be for the military. So it's really hard if you're going to take down networks to avoid having 96% civilian damage. Another third way in which you can hit civilians with a cyber attack is the stepping stones. So Stuxnet used propagation, automated propagation methods. So it would get on one computer, it basically had worms, and would use worms to spread to other machines and then onto other machines, because there was no direct, easy access to the target sites. And so this is going to be continue to be popular for the reason that it's a lot easier to attack a military site from a civilian site than it is from trying to get onto the military site directly. So one of the problems with that is then you're violating neutrality of states in many cases. If you're doing, if you're attacking from one state to another, you're basic, and the state you're attacking from is neutral, you're basically violating its neutrality. So here's if you go back to the original Hague Convention, the wording that I'm thinking of here says belligerents are forbidden to move troops or convoys or munitions of war across the territory of neutral power. So cyber weapons are sort of like munitions, right? You're going to try to get them to the target, and so this seems to be a violation of the original Hague Convention without even having to update the wording. Fourth issue, one of the ways that attacks can spread is from the reporting mechanism that I already hinted at before. So anytime you got a cyber attack, it's important to analyze it, for one thing, to stop it. And so when you attack a military site, that information about the attack may get out. And there are several mechanisms that it may get out to civilian sites. One is that the military may not realize they're being attacked. If you've got a stealthy attack that involves doing something subtle to systems. So for instance, there's an extra time delay on your air defense system, so your air defense system doesn't respond as fast as it's supposed to do. That's a rather stealthy attack. It might take a long time to figure that out, and somebody might think, oh, well, that's just a problem with the hardware, and report it to a civilian authority. So I think there's a number of ways things can get out. Of course, there are also automated methods. Often with software, there's an automated bug report mechanism nowadays, so that if something goes wrong with the software, it automatically reports it to the vendor, so the vendor can compile those records and see if there's a problem with a particular part of the software. So if you got that for military sites, it could be a problem. Now people say, oh, well, you're not going to connect military sites to the internet. It depends. You know, we've got a lot of unclassified sites in the Navy, for instance, and a lot of those are connected directly to the internet and will report stuff. But even if it's a classified site, it's turned out, I recently had a student doing industrial control systems. It turns out with industrial control systems, there are all sorts of backdoors. And one of the reasons for that is that they need to update, right? Anytime the software is updated, they need a mechanism that they're going to have to open a hole to the internet and connect, and of course updates occur regularly, so often there are open holes, back doors to the internet that allow industrial control systems to work, and this has turned out, unfortunately, on a few occasions in the US military too. So I'm worried that there will be backdoors that will allow things to get reported. Of course, if it's a really puzzling attack, you probably want to bring in some civilians anyway to see if they can figure out what's going wrong with it, because the real experts are the ones in the civilian world that know sorts of things that could occur and what's going on. So news of an attack may get reported, and then people analyze it, and then damage can be propagated once criminals see what was reported and see what mechanism was using. Here's just to show you some of the sites that are that I'm thinking of. Here's the US CERT, which gives includes a lot of useful stuff about all the attacks that have been going on and what their characteristics are and what sort of software they're affecting and things like that. And so they post things like vulnerability notes, which explain in more details when you should see this problem. The NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States, also has a site that tries to summarize things in a shorter way. And then there are some more detailed sites, like Security Focus is a particularly interesting one. It tries to be like a blog that includes information about new reported vulnerabilities, and so they try to include a lot of information about all these different vulnerabilities that they've heard they may not have analyzed yet. So often this gives you very detailed information about what the vulnerability is. So here's, for instance, some example about a particular I think this was a graphics and rendering engine vulnerability, and it tells you where the stuff was, and in some cases it gives the actual code that was modified in order to create the vulnerability. When I sent this to one of my colleagues, by the way, his antivirus software triggered on this slide because it saw that it was a well-known vulnerability. So yeah, that's actual code that will actually hurt your computer. And people post this, and it's freely available on the internet. So that's my worry, that somebody does some clever cyber attack. Particularly, of course, clever cyber attacks are very interesting to civilians, right? They want to build some ways to respond to every type of attack. So something that's clever that occurs in cyber warfare is more likely to get reported to civilians than just your ordinary criminal attack. So that's what I'm worried about. Fifth method you can hit cyber warfare can hit civilians is the propagation mechanisms. As I say, Stuxnet had that automated propagation. That means viruses are worms, generally speaking, and there's lots of ways that you can do things like that. Now, generally speaking, I'm not a fan of using automated propagation mechanisms for a cyber attack. They're too hard to control, for one thing. Stuxnet attempted to control itself by checking what computer systems it was on, but of course the problem is, how do you know if it's a military system? I do a lot of digital forensics. That's my major research technical area. And I've got 4,000 computer images, by the way, we're looking at. And I can assure you it's very hard to look at those and tell which ones are military and which are civilian. It's not like there's a little notation somewhere that says I'm a military system. And of course the software, military systems have a lot of civilian software. It's very rare you see some particular thing that's specific to the military, because they don't look at weapon systems or anything like that. So it's really hard to tell when you're propagating if you have propagated it onto a civilian system or not. You'll hopefully, if you're on a network, the network doesn't have connections, but again, the backdoor problem can mean there's connections to civilian stuff. It's tough. Yeah, so what you get with propagation is you get this kind of curve, the logistic curve, which says that if you've got a certain rate of propagation, you're going to propagate to so many computers. But the interesting thing about this is this has a tipping point. We basically, with any epidemic, you get a point where that's very sensitive to fluctuations. So if you get more than a certain degree of propagation, everybody's going to get infected eventually. But if it's less than that tipping point, then it's going to be self-limiting. And it's very hard to predict where that tipping point is. So it's very hard for an offensive planner for cyber warfare to pick the right tipping point to make sure that it isn't likely to propagate to civilians and will just sort of die out or be self-limiting. Sixth method that attacks can propagate to computer systems, the spoofing. Of course, one of the things that happens in cyber attacks is people pretend to be a different source than they really are. I mean, this is a good force multiplier for cyber attacks. Usually that's not too hard, because the data is just basically packet data. Here's the TCP header, basically, and you just got a bunch of data here, and all you have to do is change the source port number and the source information that's stored with that, and you basically can pretend to be coming from one place you're not. Now, of course, conventional software, the conventional protocols won't let you do that. However, you can install your own computer system on the network that doesn't have to obey the protocols. It's specially tailored to modify the packets that go through it, and do whatever you like with that. So that means that, and of course, if you're going to do that, what you should do is impersonate a civilian site. There's no reason trying to acknowledge that you're a military site, right? Because then, people are going to probably block you. So what you want to do is use basically a civilian, innocent-looking civilian address if you're going to do spoofing, and that just makes everything more detailed. So what could happen is that if there's an automated response, like the gentleman was talking about yesterday, automated cyber defense, there may be an automated fence which tries to block the site that is sending its stuff, and that may damage the site. So if it's a civilian that was spoofed, you may end up damaging a civilian by the automated response. I'm generally not a big fan of automated network response because of the various problems associated with that. Now, I also want to talk about some other problems that I see with cyber warfare. Given all these problems with distinction, there's some more fundamental problems, I think, with distinction in cyber warfare. And one of these is related to the concept of perfidy, which means impersonation of neutral or civilian personnel by military personnel. And so a lot of what I've been talking about is very similar to the notion of perfidy, where you have basically some civilian software that is modified. Usually what happens is the civilian software is modified to do something malicious. Usually that's the way you're going to get effect. Just sending something to a computer over the network is not going to cause it to do anything bad. But what you've got to do is change the actual software on that system in order to get it to do something. So I would argue that this is very similar to this clause in the Geneva Conventions additional protocol, the feigning of civilian non-combatant status. Now, whether it actually is perfidy or not, I'm leaving that open to other people. I'm going to call it cyber-perfidy, which is sort of in quotation marks, right? So it's like perfidy, but I'll let you guys decide whether it really is perfidy or not. Doesn't need, by the way, the additional protocol, it doesn't say you have to risk killing someone. This is one of the things people said, oh no, it can't possibly be perfidy. For instance, Dorothy Denning said this, and because nobody's being killed. But that's not necessarily the case, and as I just gave you an argument for Stuxnet, the effect was similar to killing of one person. So, I don't think that that's a key issue here. Anyway, the reason it's bad, perfidy is bad, because it increases the risk of being neutral, and we don't want that to occur. We want civilians to be untouched, basically, by the military operations. Anyway, so why do we have this risk of perfidy? Because computers are actually very resistant to cyber attack. The problem is that they're not so resistant to modifications. So if you want to modify things inside them, subvert them basically, you can put your own operating system in there, and then you can do all sorts of bad things. Generally, there are a lot of lines of defense. There are things like security kernels on computer systems, which are supposed to be the core stuff of the computer that needs to be kept intact, and usually there are careful controls in the hardware as well as the software, so you can't change that security kernel. And then there are parity values. You can basically compute numbers to see if something has been modified on your computer system. I do a lot of stuff with hash values on computers and the files on computers. And anti-malware software, of course, we've got. Intrusion detection systems, I've done some research on those. And then there's security policy implementation. So there are many lines of defense usually on a computer system. So the only way that you can really do anything is to subvert something, and that sounds like perfidy, because that's what you're impersonating what is normal software by some other method. So unfortunately, there's all these great targets for perfidy, operating system, file management system. Update management, I think, is increasingly going to be a problem in the future, because if you can change the updates so you update it with malicious software, that's a real easy way to get an attack onto a system. And then, of course, networking and stuff like that. Domain name service is important. You can also do things with the hardware, but the problem with that is it's probably a one-time use, and it's not going to be something you can continue. So all these are typically in civilian targets, and so raise a lot of questions about whether they're legitimate targets or not. So here's some examples. The state modifies the threat database of a victim so that the database identifies Red Cross vehicles as military targets. You've got a target database, right, in many command and control systems that lists the possible targets. So, suppose something goes in and just changes that, changes some data, it's not destroying any software, just changing the data in there. So that seems like a classic case that's similar to the usual definition of perfidy of people with putting on uniforms of the Red Cross or something like that. So now some of these are more arguable. The state modifies the origin information of the attack so that they appear to be coming from a neutral country. State sabotages DNS servers, the domain name service, so that causes failure of the network traffic. That sort of malicious sort of thing, and that brings up the dual use sort of issue that I was bringing up before. So you can argue either way on that. And exploiting maliciously modified integrated circuit chips. The issue here would be if you're only affecting 10% of the machines, maybe that's enough to, not enough to have a significant effect, what you would call a significant civilian effect. Here's the Geneva Conventions additional protocol on civilian targeting. Prohibit attack, destroy, remove, or render useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. So I would argue that a lot of these computer things are indispensable now. It used to be that there were some options, but nowadays it's not like we have an option about using these kinds of things. So we're getting to the point where computers are essential as food, clothing, and shelter. And because, for one thing, our food is going to come by computers, right? I mean, computer systems are controlling the delivery of all these things, right? And so if we don't have computers working, we're not going to be able to get those particular things. So I disagree with the claim that people seem to think that, attacking computers is like attacking something secondary to the main human interests. I would argue things, at least in the last 20 years, have changed enough that they're no longer an option anymore. And so that attacking them could be more a serious sort of thing. Some other discussion cases, and I'm running out of time here. One other thing I want to point out, though, is that reading that Geneva Convention protocol thing, a lot of cyber attacks are like product tampering. And there are laws in countries against product tampering. There's a famous case in the United States from the 1970s where somebody put cyanide into over-the-counter medication, for instance. And so this is sort of similar to that, this idea of modifying an operating system to do something. Now, of course, when you buy software, you have to sign an end user license agreement, which says that you're not allowed to modify the software. And so a lot of these cyberwar things will violate that end user license agreement. So why is the agreement important? Because if people start modifying things, they may cause damage to other types of systems. Of course, the manufacturer doesn't want versions, or they're trying to protect their intellectual property, so they don't want different versions of it. But in general, it's a bad idea to modify existing products. And so that's one of the things that bothers me about cyber warfare. That does sound awfully close to the product tampering idea. And there are lots of severe laws in the United States about product tampering and lots of other countries too. So is this really the sort of warfare we want in the future? I mean, I see a lot of possible problems with people that say, I work with a lot of gung-ho military guys, right? They're all eager to use cyber warfare for things, but I see a number of different problems with it. The casualty issue, as I said, people have said, oh, well, you're not going to hurt anybody with cyber warfare, so we should be able to do cyber warfare all the time, and have low-level cyber conflicts of various sorts. But the problem is, since you've got this force multiplier effect on all this civilian software that could possibly get the attack, that you can quickly mount up the costs of doing an attack. And also, I'm just suspicious of any weapons as being considered non-lethal. I mean, you probably heard the arguments about crowd control foam, for instance, as being an alternative to warfare. And so for some reason, that's not caught on because people realized after a while that crowd control foam is a good way to suffocate, right? So actually, it's a lethal technology, too. It's pretty hard to make any technology that's a weapon that's completely non-lethal. Here's some of the statistics, by the way, from Iraq that might be a useful analogy. So this is just from 2003, some of the statistics on how many people were killed in Iraq by the collateral damage. And of course, there were a lot of health problems with the damage to the infrastructure. So Particularly, I was interested in these two medical things here that we're trying to get, this one here, the Lancet, and this Lancet article is really interesting to read, by the way. And then the PLOS medicine survey that quite a lot of people. So this goes through up till a few years ago. Today it's probably more like 1 million collateral damage. So the Iraq operation shouldn't have been it had near as much collateral damage. Should have been managed better. I can criticize the US military for that anyway. Now I have written about reversibility if you've seen some of my other articles. One of the things I've advocated is reversible cyber attacks. One thing you can do in cyberspace you can't do with other types of weapons is make a lot of really elegant ways to reverse it. However, the problem, that won't work for a lot of the things I've mentioned here in attacking civilians, because often the civilian damage is in the exploitation of the method. And so once the idea for the attack has gotten out, there's no way to put it back in the bottle. It's going to get out and people are going to be harmed by it. So unfortunately, I don't think reversibility is going to help with the collateral damage problem with civilians. So I want to move on to something a little more positive here. So here's my ethical principles. Try to summarize on one slide what I would consider ethical cyber warfare. Now, whether the US military will follow these or not, I don't think so, but at least their attempt to do it. I do have students, I can influence my students, right? And some of them are doing policy sort of papers. So one thing, I think we should avoid dual use. That doesn't mean totally avoid them, just like in regular warfare, but there's certainly we can do more planning to avoid dual use targets and not try to modify operating systems if we can avoid it. Minimize the propagation through civilian cyberspace. I don't like the idea of propagation since there are other ways to attack rather than automated propagation. Design the attack so the details are unlikely to be reported. Actually, this is a sort of situation where you don't want things to be reported. Make it a specialized military system. If it attacks only a military system, then it makes it pretty obvious it's a cyber attack. And make the target specialized military software, then it's not likely to propagate. Make the attack highly effective so it cannot be misinterpreted. Or an alternative is conceal it really well so it won't be noticed. And it'll just degrade performance on some particular thing, some particular operation. And also attack countries having significant numbers of personnel to understand the attack. If we attack a country that doesn't really know what's going on, while it may be effective, it's going to complain to other countries and report all the details of the attack and try to get help from other countries. So information is going to get out if you attack a significantly weaker country. Also, acknowledge it. I've been a big arguer for voluntary acknowledgement of cyber attacks, and so that's one of my complaints about Stuxnet. Some countries should have acknowledged it, and I won't say what country. An Israeli journalist called me up and tried to get me to say it was an Israeli operation, and I would not state that. So, cyber safe havens. So one idea proposed by some other people is to have safe havens on the internet that you could claim would not be attacked. And so that's kind of a nice idea if you could figure out some way to segment them from the rest of the internet. So for instance, Google servers, everybody depends on Google servers, so why not just declare those off limits for cyber warfare? It's hard to think how they could directly contribute to the civilian usage. So there could be things like that. And power plants too, we're very worried about power plants. I have a really interesting thesis by a student recently on industrial control systems you can read on my website. Medical systems, certainly, those are, so we can make a list of those things, say those are off limits and try to enforce that. Of course, it's hard to enforce that, but at least if governments agree to that, that makes people start thinking about that during targeting and planning. This will work if we make steps also to segregate military networks from civilian networks. Now, that does not mean we can't use the hardware for the two. So one of the things I want to point out is that you do have some really good logical segmentation today. This is the whole idea behind virtualization. You probably heard this buzzword that's been used a lot. Everybody wants to virtualize things now in cyberspace. And that actually is helpful for the civilian distinction issues that we're talking about here, because it means even if you're sharing the same hardware, it's very difficult for an attack on one part of the logical segmentation to get out to the other part of the logical segmentation. So I think we should applaud virtualization methods and good, tough cloud methods. I mean, there are some various ways to implement cloud computing, but some of them can actually be really helpful for, I think, for the cyber warfare problem. Also, I had another really interesting thesis recently by a student on cyber coercion. So the idea of this is cyber attacks short of cyber warfare that you use for sort of policy things. So for instance, China has been threatening to do something in the South China Sea, and they mass some ships there. We could do an operation in the United States where all of a sudden their ships don't seem to have working computers. And that would be an illustration, even without attacking them directly, that you know, maybe their operation won't go so well because we have probably other things we could do. So I think that's probably a good use of a lot of the cyber attack stuff that I'm talking about here, that we use it for cyber coercion to make a point. Of course, the problem with this is that, you know, that since it's easy to do, we could get nations cyber coercing on one back and forth for quite a while, and it could lead to escalation after a period of time. And so, you know, my student thought about those, and there's some interesting issues with that. Okay, so conclusions. Maintaining the principle of distinction is harder than it seems. So there was surprising damage from Stuxnet, and there's going to be surprising damage, I'm sure, in the future from other things. The problem is there's a lot of civilian infrastructure that's used, and we want to avoid damage it in cyber warfare. One of the many of the attack methods do have similarities to perfidy and product tampering. That's one of the things that bothers me. So they seem awfully close to things that have been prohibited in warfare and conventional warfare. And of course, many involve invading neutral countries too, which is also a problem. So these raise serious questions people are going to have to think about. Of course, the attacks can vary a lot on the spectrum from trivial to serious, so we're going to have to think about design. So it's not just a straightforward thing where we want to outlaw all sorts of attacks, or allow all sorts of attacks, but somewhere in the middle.